Her dad shook my hand at the family barbecue. She talks about you every day. Her father shook my hand at the family barbecue, leaned in close enough that I could smell the charcoal on his shirt, and said 6 words that rearranged my entire summer. She talks about you every day. I was standing in a backyard full of people I didn't belong to, holding a plate of food I hadn't touched, and the man who'd hired me to build his kitchen was telling me his daughter was in love with me. I should have said something. I should have told him I knew, that I'd known since the 2nd week when she started showing up at the house with iced tea and questions about dovetail joints that nobody who isn't a carpenter has ever once in the history of woodworking asked on purpose. But the truth is, I'd spent 6 weeks convincing myself that a woman like Ani Layton doesn't fall for the guy her parents hired to fix their countertops. So I just stood there, holding my plate, while her father looked at me like I was the dumbest smart man he'd ever shaken hands with. He was right. Let me tell you how I got there. My name is Milo Tavares. I was 31 years old, and I built kitchens for a living. Not the demolition part, not the plumbing, not the tile, the wood, cabinets, built-ins, islands, trim, finish carpentry. The detail work that people touch every day of their lives and never once think about who made it. I drove a van with my name on the side that I'd lettered myself, badly, because a professional sign cost $400, and my hand lettering cost a can of paint and a humbling afternoon. I had sawdust in my hair more often than not. My knuckles were permanently nicked. I smelled like wood finish and coffee, and the particular brand of exhaustion that comes from spending 8 hours on your knees, fitting trim into corners that aren't square, because no house in Massachusetts has a square corner. They were all built by optimists in 1920, and they've been settling ever since. I grew up in Fall River, Portuguese family, big and loud. Sunday dinner was 12 people minimum, half the conversation in English, half in Portuguese. Someone always yelling across the table about something that had happened in 1997 that nobody was ever going to agree on. My mother could silence a room with a wooden spoon. My father could fix anything in any house with whatever was in his truck. He was a plumber. Good one. The kind of man who showed up on time, called you by your first name, laughed with you while he worked, and left your bathroom better than he found it. I need to tell you what happened to my father, because without it you won't understand the fence, and without the fence you won't understand why I stood in a backyard holding a plate of food like a man who'd been handed something he wasn't sure he was allowed to eat. My dad was working a job when I was 13. Big house, nice neighborhood, the kind of clients who had a guest bathroom they called the powder room. He was there 3 days fixing a supply line. The homeowner's wife was around during the day, talked to him, brought him water, asked about his family. My dad, being my dad, was friendly. He's friendly with everyone. That's not a strategy. That's just the man. He asked about her kids. He complimented the tile work. He laughed at something she said. On the 3rd day, the husband called my father's boss and said the plumber had been overly familiar with his wife. That was the phrase, overly familiar. He wanted my dad removed from the job immediately. My father hadn't done anything. He'd been himself, warm, open, the same man he was with everyone. But he was a plumber in their house, in their space, by their permission, and the husband had decided that a man with a wrench was being too comfortable in a place that wasn't his. His boss pulled him off the job. No argument, no investigation, no conversation. Just, you're done. Don't go back. My father came home that night and sat at the dinner table and told us about it in a voice I'd never heard from him before. Flat, careful, the voice of a man who'd just been taught something he was never going to unlearn. When you work in their house, he told me, you're a guest, not family. You're there because they hired you, and you leave when the job's done. Don't forget the difference. He didn't say don't be friendly. He didn't say don't be yourself. But what I heard, at 13, was simpler and sharper. Don't reach for things in other people's houses. The contract says cabinets. The contract doesn't say daughter. I carried that fence into every house I've ever worked in. Be excellent. Be warm. Be professional. And whatever you do, don't confuse their hospitality for your invitation. Their house, their space, their rules, their family. You build the kitchen and you leave. That fence worked fine for 18 years. And then Frank Layton hired me to gut his kitchen, and his daughter started showing up. The Laytons lived in a colonial on a tree-lined street in a town just north of Fall River, the kind of house with a wraparound porch and a front door that was never locked because everybody just walked in. Frank was a retired electrician. His wife Helen taught 4th grade. They were the clients you pray for, the ones who treat you like a person, not a contractor. Frank stood in the doorway every morning, with his coffee and his opinions about countertop edges, and he'd tell me stories about the kitchen when his kids were small. Ani took her first steps right there, he'd say, pointing at a subfloor I was about to tear up. Helen cried, I cried, the dog didn't care. Helen fed my crew lunch without being asked. She made a Portuguese kale soup the second week because she'd overheard me speaking Portuguese on the phone with my mother, and it was good, and I told her so, and she lit up. Good clients, good family, fence firmly in place. Then, second week, Ani showed up. She didn't live there. She had her own apartment 20 minutes away, worked as a speech therapist at a pediatric clinic. But on a Tuesday morning in the second week of her parents' kitchen renovation, she walked through the front door, said, "Just checking on Mom and Dad," and stayed for 2 hours. She sat on the living room couch that had a view into the kitchen. She watched me install upper cabinets. I was on a ladder, fitting a frame into a wall that was, predictably, not square. And I was talking to myself the way I do when I'm problem-solving, which is an embarrassing habit I've never been able to break. And at some point, I realized she was watching me, and listening, and smiling. "Why'd you choose that hinge?" she asked. I looked at her. Most people don't ask about hinges. Most people don't see hinges. A hinge is the most invisible piece of hardware in a kitchen, which is exactly why I care about them so much. The things nobody sees are the things that have to work the hardest. I told her. I talked about hinges for probably 4 minutes, which is 3.5 minutes longer than any human being has ever wanted to hear about hinges, and she listened with her whole face, which is a phrase I've never used before, but it's the only way to describe the way Ani Layton pays attention, like the person talking is doing something worth watching. It's probably the speech therapist in her. She works with kids. She's trained to listen. That's what I told myself. She's a professional listener. This is not personal. The fence is fine. She came back Thursday, and the following Tuesday, and the following Thursday. 14 times in 6 weeks. I know because Danny counted. Danny was my foreman. He'd worked with me for 5 years, and he had no filter and less tact, which made him excellent at drywall and terrible at subtlety. By the 3rd week, he was giving me looks across the kitchen every time she walked in. "Brother," he said one afternoon, while she was in the other room talking to Helen, "she's not here for the cabinets. She's the client's daughter. She's a grown woman who has driven 20 minutes 14 times to watch you sand things. 14. I'm counting. It's my new hobby. She's visiting her parents. Her parents are in the living room. She's in the kitchen. With you. Asking you about dovetail joints." He looked at me with the specific pity of a man watching another man build a fence in front of a door nobody asked him to close. "She brought you iced tea separately. She handed it to you. She didn't set it down. She put it in your hand. That's not hospitality, Milo. That's a woman finding reasons to touch your fingers." It was iced tea. It was 14 iced teas. I changed the subject. I'm a professional subject changer. I've been changing the subject on my own feelings since I was 13. But here's the thing. Here's the part I couldn't change the subject away from, no matter how hard I tried. I liked her. I liked her in the way that starts quiet and gets louder, the way you notice a sound in a house that was always there, but you only start hearing once you've stopped long enough to listen. I liked her voice, which was warm and specific, the way she pronounced words carefully, because that's her training. I liked that she sat on the counter I'd just installed, even though I told her the sealant wasn't dry, and she said, "I'll risk it," and stayed there, swinging her legs while I worked below her. I liked the text she sent me, a photo of a cabinet she'd seen at a vintage store. "Is this dovetail or finger joint?" asking for strictly professional reasons. I liked the way she said my name, Milo, like she'd decided it was a good name and was confirming it every time. And I kept all of it behind the fence. Every bit. I folded it up and put it in the same drawer where my father put his humiliation, and I kept working. Helen noticed. She started disappearing whenever Ani was in the kitchen. Suddenly needed groceries, had to run an errand, be back in an hour. The first time, I thought it was coincidence. The fourth time, I understood that Helen Layton was creating empty rooms for her daughter, the way a good host seats people next to each other at dinner, quietly and on purpose. Frank noticed. He said nothing, but I'd catch him in the doorway with his coffee, watching me work while Ani sat on the counter asking about wood grain, and he had an expression on his face that I couldn't quite read, something between amusement and patience, the look of a man waiting for a slow kid to finish a math problem. The closest I came to breaking was a Thursday in the 5th week. We were choosing the finish for the island, Ani and me, standing at the counter with 4 wood samples between us. She reached for the same sample I was reaching for, and our hands collided, and she didn't pull back. Her fingers stayed against mine on the piece of walnut, and she looked at me, and I looked at her, and the kitchen was very quiet, and I had a pencil behind my ear, the way I always do, and she reached up, slowly, deliberately, with a small smile that was not about wood finishes, and she took the pencil from behind my ear and tucked it behind her own. "How do I look?" she said. And I said, without thinking, without the fence, without anything except the truth, "Like you belong in this kitchen." I heard it land. I heard what I'd said. A working man in a client's house, telling the client's daughter she belonged. I retreated into professionalism so fast I practically dove into a cabinet. I grabbed a sanding block and started sanding something that didn't need sanding, and I talked about polyurethane for 90 straight seconds, which is a personal record and not one I'm proud of. She put the pencil back behind my ear. Her fingertips brushed my temple. She didn't say anything. She went to find her mother. I sanded that same spot for another 10 minutes. Danny walked past and said, "You're going to sand through the countertop, Romeo." And I told him to go check the baseboard in the dining room. And he went, laughing. And I stood there with my sanding block and my father's fence, and the feeling of her fingertips on my temple, and I thought, "You are in so much trouble." The last day of the job was a Wednesday. The kitchen was done. It was beautiful. My best work. Cherry cabinets, quartz countertops, custom island with the walnut finish she'd helped me choose. Trim work so tight, you couldn't fit a playing card in the seams. I did the final walkthrough with Frank. He ran his hand over the island. He opened and closed 3 cabinet doors, slowly, the way you test a hinge when you actually care about the hinge. "This is the best kitchen I've ever stood in," Frank said. "You're standing in the only kitchen you've ever stood in." "I've been in other kitchens, Milo. Not any I've built." He laughed and shook my hand and gave me the check, and I loaded my tools into the van with the bad hand lettering, and I drove away from the Layton house for the last time, and Ani wasn't there. She hadn't come on the last day. I noticed. I told myself I didn't notice. I told myself the job was done, and the professional reason to be in that house was over, and this was exactly how it was supposed to go. You build the kitchen, and you leave. That's the contract. The contract doesn't say daughter, but loading that van felt like packing up more than tools. It felt like leaving a house that had started, somewhere in 6 weeks and 14 iced teas, to feel less like a client's house and more like somewhere I was allowed to be. And now I wasn't. The fence had done its job. The fence always does its job. Frank called on Friday. We're doing a thing tomorrow. Saturday. Barbecue. Christening the new kitchen. The whole family's coming. He paused. You should be there. You built the damn thing. You should eat in it. Every instinct I had said no. The job's over. You're not family. Don't overstep. But Frank Layton had a voice that made saying no feel like arguing with gravity, and something in me, something small and stubborn that the fence hadn't quite killed, said yes. Saturday! The Layton backyard. 25 people easy. 3 generations. Kids running through a sprinkler. Somebody's uncle managing the grill, with the seriousness of a man commanding a warship. Music, coming from a speaker on the porch. Potato salad, in quantities that suggested either extreme optimism or past trauma. I walked in through the side gate with a 6-pack and the immediate, overwhelming certainty that I was the only person there who didn't share a last name or a bloodline with anyone else. I did what I always do at parties, which is find the kitchen, my kitchen. I stood in it and I touched the island, and I checked a cabinet door. The hinge was perfect. The soft close engaged at exactly the right moment. The door settled without a sound, and for a second, I felt the pride of a man standing inside something he made with his hands. Frank's mother found me. She was 80-something, small, the kind of grandmother who takes your arm and doesn't give it back. She asked about the hardware. I told her about the hinges. She patted my hand and said, "You have good hands, dear. You can tell a man by his hands." I thought about my father, his hands, the wrench in them, the way they went still at the dinner table the night he came home from the job. I ended up in the backyard with a plate I couldn't eat, standing near the fence, always the fence, watching the Laytons be a family. They were good at it the way some people are good at music, natural and loud, and completely unaware of how rare it was. Helen was making sure everyone had seconds. Frank was flipping things on the grill and telling a story he'd clearly told 100 times. Kids were screaming in the sprinkler. And I was standing at the edge of all of it with sawdust still under my fingernails, wondering what I was doing here, when Ani arrived. She came through the back gate in a sundress and sandals, and she wasn't his client's daughter anymore. She was just a woman in a backyard in the late afternoon light, and she looked across the crowd and found me. Not her mother, not her father, not the cousins or the uncle at the grill. She found me, standing at the fence, and she smiled. It wasn't the kitchen smile. It wasn't the iced tea smile or the hinge question smile. It was the smile of a person who'd been looking for someone specific and had found them exactly where she expected them to be. At the edge of things, standing behind a fence that only he could see. My chest did something I'm not going to describe, because I am a 31-year-old carpenter from Fall River, and I have a reputation. She started making her way across the yard toward me, and that's when Frank appeared at my elbow. He had a beer in one hand, he extended the other. I shook it, the professional handshake, the good job handshake, the thanks for the kitchen handshake, a handshake I'd given and received 100 times at the end of 100 jobs. But Frank didn't let go. He held my hand, and he leaned in, close enough that I could smell the charcoal on his shirt and the beer on his breath, and he looked me in the eyes, and he said, "She talks about you every day. You know that, right?" I went still. Every day since the second week. His voice was low, just for me, under the music and the kids and the grill smoke. At dinner, on the phone with her mother, she talks about the cabinets and the hinges and the dovetail joints, and her mother and I sit there and look at each other, because our daughter, is not talking about the cabinets, Milo. He let go of my hand. I hired you to build a kitchen. You're a good carpenter, best I've ever worked with. But my daughter didn't drive 20 minutes 14 times to watch a good carpenter. I stood there with my plate and my fence, and a man's eyes on me, and I couldn't speak. I know that look on your face, Frank said, quieter. I know it because I wore it. Your father was a plumber. Mine was an electrician. And I married a woman whose father was a surgeon, who looked at me the way you're looking at yourself right now, like I wasn't the right kind of man to be standing in his house. He took a drink of his beer. I have been exactly where you're standing, son. Working-class kid in somebody else's backyard, wondering if he's allowed to want what he wants. And I'm telling you, that fence you built, the one you keep standing behind, that's the only thing in the way. My daughter isn't being kind. My daughter is being brave. She has been brave for 6 weeks, and you're making her do all the work. He clapped me on the shoulder. Not hard, the way a father does it. And he walked back to the grill and left me standing there, with my world on its side. Ani was 10 feet away. She'd stopped, watching me and her father, and now she was walking the last few steps, and she stood next to me at the fence. The fence, always the fence. And she said, "What did my dad say to you? You look like you've been hit." "I have been hit," I said. "Just not with anything I can file an insurance claim for." She laughed, short, uncertain. She could tell something had shifted. And I did something I had never done in 18 years of working in other people's houses. I stopped standing behind the fence. "Your dad told me you talk about me every day." She closed her eyes. "I'm going to murder him. Is it true?" She opened her eyes. She didn't deny it. She didn't joke. She looked at me straight on, and she said, "Yes, it's true. I have talked about you every day since the 2nd week, and I have driven 20 minutes 14 times, and I asked you about dovetail joints and hinges and wood finishes because I couldn't figure out any other way to be near you that you'd let me. Because every time I got close, you'd talk about polyurethane for 90 seconds and back up. And I thought, either he doesn't see me, or he does, and he doesn't want what I want. And either one is terrible, but at least if I keep showing up, I'll know which one it is." "I see you," I said. My voice was rough. "I've seen you since week 2, since the hinges. I just didn't think I was allowed to." "Allowed?" Something hurt crossed her face. "Why wouldn't you be allowed?" And standing at a fence in a backyard full of her family, with the grill smoke and the sprinkler, and the uncle's playlist, and the sound of a house full of people who loved each other, I told her. The short version, because I'm not a speech guy, I'm a hands guy. My father. The plumbing job. Overly familiar. The fence. The invisible one I'd carried into every house I'd ever worked in. The one that said you're a guest, not family. Don't reach past the contract. I told her I'd liked her since the hinges, and I'd built every inch of her parents' kitchen, knowing it would be the last time I had a reason to be in the same room with her. And I hadn't said a word, because the contract said cabinets, and the fence said don't, and I am my father's son, and my father's son doesn't reach for things in other people's houses. She was quiet for a long moment. The party went on around us, all that family noise, all that life. "Milo," she said, "you built my family's kitchen with your hands. My mother makes you soup in your own language. My grandmother thinks you have good hands. My father just crossed a backyard to give you permission that I don't think you ever needed." She stepped closer, and I have spent 6 weeks sitting on a counter I knew wasn't dry, borrowing your pencil, finding reasons to touch your hands over iced tea glasses. At what point were you going to believe that you were already inside the fence? I looked at her, the sundress and the late light and the whole family around us, and the sound of something clicking into place, a soft close hinge engaging the way it's supposed to, quiet and right, and exactly on time. "I built you a kitchen," I said, Because I'm me, and when the big moment arrives, I apparently revert to stating facts about carpentry. You built my family a kitchen, she corrected, smiling. The question is whether you're going to let yourself stay in it. She took my hand, took it the way she'd taken the pencil, deliberately, with her fingers lacing through mine, and she pulled me through the yard, past the grill, past the cousins, past her father, who raised his beer without a word, through the back door, into the kitchen. My kitchen, the cherry cabinets, and the quartz, and the walnut island, and the hinges nobody ever notices, all of it built by my hands, all of it still mine, in the way that the things you make are always partly yours, even after you hand them over. She kissed me, standing on the floor I'd laid. Her hands came up to my face, sawdust and all, nicked knuckles and all, and she held my face the way I hold wood when I'm fitting a joint, carefully, like the alignment mattered, like getting it right was worth taking time over. And I kissed her back in a kitchen I'd built for someone else's family, and she tasted like lemonade in summer, and outside I could hear the whole Layton family pretending very loudly not to be watching through the window, and I didn't care. For the first time in 18 years, I didn't care about the fence, because the woman in front of me had spent 6 weeks walking through it like it wasn't there, and her father had told me it was okay, and the grandmother thought I had good hands, and the kitchen was mine, and maybe, so was this. 14 times? I said against her mouth. 14 times. She was laughing and pressing her forehead against mine. Do you know how much gas that cost me? You owe me so many iced teas. I'll build you a kitchen. You already built me a kitchen. I'll build you another one. That's a lot of kitchens, Milo. I'm a carpenter. It's what I've got. She kissed me again, and through the window I heard Danny's voice, because Danny was apparently also at this barbecue, yelling, 14 iced teas, brother, and I'm going to let you imagine the gesture I made in his direction, because we're in polite company. We started dating, properly, out loud, in front of people. I kept building kitchens. She kept working with kids. Sunday dinners expanded. The Tavares family and the Layton family, combined, which was roughly 30 people and 2 languages, and someone always yelling about something from 1997, and Frank and my mother arguing about whether electricians or plumbers have harder jobs, while Helen and my father sat next to each other and smiled and said nothing and understood each other perfectly. Frank shakes my hand every time I walk through the front door, every single time, and I finally understand that it was never the end of job handshake. It was never the thank you for the kitchen handshake. It was the same handshake from the very beginning, the one that said welcome, the one that said you're not a guest, the one that said come inside. My dad met Ani on a Sunday. I watched him shake her hand, this man who'd spent 20 years behind his own version of the fence, and Ani held on and asked him about his work, and called it important and meant it. And my father looked at me across the room with an expression I'd never seen on his face. Not big. He wasn't a big expression man, and neither am I. Just a small, quiet shift in something that had been set wrong for a long time. He didn't say much. He just nodded. But the nod meant she doesn't see the fence, and neither should you. So let me ask you something. Since you made it all the way through a story about a man who spent 18 years building invisible fences between himself and every good thing he was too scared to reach for, is there a fence in your life you built yourself? Not one someone put up to keep you out, one you put up to keep yourself in. A line you drew between who you are and who you're allowed to want, based on something somebody told you a long time ago about where men like you belong. Maybe there's someone on the other side of it right now, showing up, bringing iced tea, asking about the hinges, doing the work you're too fenced in to see for what it is. And maybe the fence feels safe, the way professional distance feels safe, the way not reaching feels safe. But here's what a carpenter can tell you about fences. They only keep things out if you build them to last. And most of the time, the person on the other side isn't looking at the fence at all. She's looking at you. So tear it down. Use the wood for something better. You know how. Tell me about it in the comments. The fence. The person who kept showing up. The moment you finally let yourself believe you were allowed to have something good. Those are the ones I read twice and carry to the job site. And if this one stayed with you, we've got memberships open. New stories every week. The shorter ones I keep just for us. No ads, just good wood and clean joints. Hit like, subscribe, and I'll be right here next time. I'll be in the kitchen. I built it. Turns out I'm allowed to stay.